Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of the Keats-Shelley Association of America's video interviews. I'm Anna Mercer, and I'm the Director of Communications. Today, our Communications Fellows are interviewing two of the founders from the Keats Letters Project, and I'm just going to introduce the four people we have on the panel today. So the two communications fellows for the Keats-Shelley Association of America for 2020 and 2021 are Mariam Wasif and Amy Wilcoxon. Mariam Wasif received her PhD from Cornell University in 2018 with a specialization in British and French literature of the long 18th century, including Romanticism, and she is currently a postdoc at the University of Paris. Amy Wilcoxon is a PhD researcher at the University of Nottingham. Her thesis focuses on creating an edition of the letters of Thomas Campbell. And we're delighted to have to be interviewed today Michael Tooney and Brian Rejak. Michael Tooney is a professor of English at Illinois Wesleyan University, and Brian Rejak is associate professor of English at Illinois State University. And they, as I mentioned at the top of this, were two of the founders of the Keats Letters Project, and they also co-edited the excellent essay collection, if I might say so, Keats's Negative Capability, New Origins and Afterlives, which appeared in 2019. So Amy and Marianne are going to lead the questioning today, so I'll hand over to Amy to put her first question to our two interviewees. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Mike and Brian, for joining us today. So our first question is, where did both of your kind of interest in Keats come from, and how did the idea come about for the Keats Letters Project? I don't know who wants to start.
If it's Mike, okay, I might start it because I think that, well, Brian had much bigger scholarly interest. My interest came in particular very directly, not actually through Keats in particular, but through negative capability. In the early 2000s, I was writing a number of reviews and review essays of contemporary American poetry and seeing how much negative capability was being used in those discussions. Over those years, I began to meet and know Brian, and we would have occasional conversations. And then finally, in around 2014, Brian and I kind of sat down together to talk specifically about the fact that the 200th anniversary of negative capability was coming up and what we might begin to do with some of that. So we kind of my interest in Keats was very much through negative capability, and then thinking about the 200th anniversary as frankly kind of an interesting opportunity to begin to kind of aim some work towards. And then as I got to know Brian more, I actually got to like him more and more, and seemed like it could be a fruitful partnership. So for me, it was very much kind of through that route, and then my interest in Keats in full kind of emerged from that process. Brian's route, I think, was very different, though.
So you got to like me more, or you got to like Keats more?
The great thing is that it was the two of you together. Some terrific friendships emerged.
Yeah. Yeah, so Keats has always been my sort of main, the writer that I've been most like invested in, both as just like a person. When I got into the study of literature, Keats was the one that like I remember reading Ode to a Nightingale and just being like, that's the stuff. And then as I went through graduate school, I sort of, played around with some other possibilities in terms of my academic focus, but, always came back to the Romantics and Keats in particular. And Mike and I met in 2011 when I started working at Illinois State, and whenever we would see each other, we'd always end up talking about Keats. Then by like 2014, we thought, maybe we should try and work on something together. And so the what became the essay collection on negative capability started, we started percolating that idea at the same time as the KLP developed. And then, so Mike and I had talked a little bit about ideas for doing some sort of Keats bicentennial thing. And then we were at the BARS conference in Cardiff in 2015. And we were at was it the Pig and Whistle?
No, so it's officially, I looked it up. It's officially the Wig and Pen, but for some reason, I think because of some cloudy memories, somebody referred to it as the Pig and Whistle, and we just went with that. So it became the Pig and Whistle for us, but we all knew where it was, and we all found our way back there a couple nights in sequence.
So so the Pig and Whistle, or Owl and Pen, there were a group of us who were, hanging out and talking about stuff, and that's essentially how the KLP took shape.
That's right.
Pub.
The best ideas happen in a pub, don't they? That's where all the great thoughts. That's where they happen. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. It did. It grew directly from that. Brian and I put together a panel on negative capability for that conference. I believe a couple of people who became contributors to the negative capability book, Anne McCarthy and our Sevi were both on that panel. And so it was already kind of beginning to take shape there, and then these larger conversations happened, and then the KLP began to take shape there. I think it was actually Kate Singer who was the person to kind of really think about. Brian and I had a few ideas, but it was Kate who was like, why isn't this a bigger project about the letters, and thinking about really tracking them letter by letter. So it was an emergent conversation, but I think it was Kate who kind of was the first one to have that big idea.
Yeah, I think our idea originally was just the This Week in Keats thing, which became kind of like a side project.
Hustle.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I remember Kate. So the other founders are Kate Singer, Anne McCarthy, Emily Sandback, and Ian Newman. And we were all at the conference for different stuff, and yeah, it was just sort of fortuitous that we all came together and went from there.
So we've talked a little bit about the origins of the project, but the bicentenary of Keats's death necessitates a melancholy end to the Keats Letters project. And your organized reading of Adonais was a really poignant time for reflection, so thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit about your recent bicentenary celebrations, and on a more positive note, what's next for the Keats Letters project?
Yeah, the Adonais event, it was another kind of fortuitous thing where the six of us, the six KLP founders and editors, were talking about a variety of different things we might do. And I think it was Anne McCarthy who at one point was like, let's just read Adonais. Like, we've got this great elegy right there. It's perfect. And then we kind of, played around with how we might go about doing that. And of course, in the context of the pandemic, this last year of Keats Bicentennials took on an additional resonance, and that weird situation of being distanced from everyone, but connected through all these kinds of Zoom events that became so commonplace in the last year or so. It allowed us to have this bicentenary event that, as we often tried to do with the KLP, it it connected with, what's happening now in the present, as we're thinking about these two moments separated by 200 years and so much else. So yeah, so that event, I felt like it was certainly, of course, a melancholy end, but I think it was a moment of community and collaboration and bringing people together, and there was a lot of warmth and affection, and that's often been a goal of the site, is to sort of have Keats be this center around which we bring people together and try to build something else. So Mike, you want to add to that?
I would agree totally. I would add as well. I think we had there was a particularly, I think, kind of moment, kind of poignant, and also a moment of kind of great conviviality when the KLP worked together with Jonathan Mulrooney and Emily Rohrbach to work with Romanticism in the Meantime, to put together an event focused on Keats's final extant letter from November 30th to Charles Brown. And so it was this kind of great moment where we got the 6 founding editors of the KLP together, and then had everybody from Romanticism in the Meantime, the people who show up for that, and kind of had a little presentation, and then a nice degree of conviviality, including a nice cocktail that Ian Newman suggested that everybody make. So, right, it really felt to me, agreed, that it's kind of melancholic, but boy, it was things were Keatsian, kind of ripe and blessed and loaded, right? So it still felt kind of very full, and yet, right, we have in a certain way begun this kind of transition from that autumnal sense of completion into another phase, and so we're beginning to kind of think about these new phases.
Yeah, so we can speak about some of the stuff we have in mind specifically going forward. So one is just, there are 252 letters, and we started out with the ambitious goal of creating, responses, content of some sort for each of those 252 letters. Spoiler alert, we did not cover all 252. So there remains work to be done with the site, just on that sort of core principle of getting people to write about or engage with the individual letters. So we will keep having new contributions, and then we also have a couple different projects we're pursuing connected with the letters. So one, actually, we're going to be doing some interviews like this as well. So in the coming months, we've been talking with some folks about doing interviews with people who've written recently about Keats. We've always had kind of a side connection with contemporary poets, trying to get the literary studies and poetry worlds to come together through Keats. And so one thing we're thinking about is having some conversations with poets about their connections with Keats. And then the big project we've got going on that's been in the works for a while is a mapping component to add to the site. So basically we're trying to create a mapping tool that will allow you to see and manipulate different information in order to see things in different ways. Basically the letters and where they've been, how they've moved about, both in terms of seeing like where Keats is sending letters to in the moment, in the 18 teens and into 1820, but then also how those letters move across the world, really, in the 200 years since. So we'll see when that comes to fruition, but that's another thing we're looking forward to in the future for the site.
That's very exciting.
Yeah,
Thank
I was
you.
going to say that sounds incredible.
Could I leap onto that just a second here? So I'd add that with the mapping, for me, again, I feel like a one-trick kind of pony when it comes to Keats. For me, it's Keats and the idea of negative capability, and both embracing it, but also trying to kind of explode it a little bit and do new things with it. And one of the new things that I think mapping could offer with Keats is Ryan and I have played with this a little bit, but one of the Keats's letters that we know exists and that we do not have in manuscript copy is the negative capability letter. And it's hard to think of a holier grail than that letter. And so to actually think about, we have a sense of, we know where it was, we know kind of where it was, when it was generally, and we know some patterns of some of those materials dispersal. And so to actually not only think about mapping out existing letters, but also potentially mapping to actually kind of search for that grail as well. It's a bit of a dream project, right? But hopefully very Keatsian as well, right? Like, it's the ardor of the pursuit that makes things real. So even if the thing doesn't turn up, the pursuit itself might be interesting. I'd simply add that the KLP has also had some conversation about potentially creating a concordance for the letters as well, that with current technologies, it feels like that could be something that could be a new level of work, but very much kind of on the order of the sorts of things we've been doing with a number of other projects as well.
Yeah, that all sounds amazing, and you've kind of anticipated my next question here. But my question now is basically, so interest in Romantic period correspondence is sort of ever increasing. There's a number of recent and ongoing letters projects. So there's the Robert Southey letters ongoing. Humphrey Davies have just been published. I'm working on Campbell's.
Yeah.
So how does the Keats Letters project kind of contribute to or add something different to the study of letters and epistolary culture? You have just kind of answered this, but I wondered if you could go into a bit more depth.
Sure. For me, the KLP, one of its main goals from the beginning was, and this might be a bit specific to Keats perhaps, but there were so many critics, right, who had been singing the praises of the letters, and then so many critics were saying these literary productions in their own right and deserve their own time and attention. And then of course there are plenty of moments of that happening in these discussions, but as most people said, right, mostly the letters are used to inform the biography or to inform our readings of the poems themselves. And so, but there was critical note that the letters are worthy of attention in and of themselves. And so that's what the KLP really wanted to do, was to kind of follow up on that and really make a space for that specific critical attention, the kind of attention you would give a poem by Keats to kind of begin to afford that kind of attention to the letters as well. And so one of the things that I would hope is that, there might be a reassessment generally of what the kind of work that letters can do. Certainly, of course, informing biographies, informing our readings of other associated works, but also seeing that the letters may, in and of themselves, be these kind of fascinating documents that are worthy of our genuine and direct attention as well.
And I think the other thing I'd say about that is just I think in Romanicism or in Romanicist scholarship in the last few decades, I think there's always been a really vibrant strain of interest in textual scholarship, bibliography, material textuality. You know, there are so many prominent Romanicists whose work engages with the history of textuality in one way or another. And I think letters are always fascinating for thinking about issues connected with that. And so, yeah, I mean, Keats and his letters are right. They're remarkable documents on their own. But I think something we've always tried to do with the KLP as well is just to broaden out, to think about bigger issues with the history of correspondence and just all the fascinating things that that Keats's letters can open out onto. Thinking about, you know, the history of empire and the way that empire and correspondence are, you know, hand in hand all the time. There's just to refer to a specific thing we've been thinking about with the mapping project. There's at least one letter that ends up in Sri Lanka with Benjamin Bailey, and in 1848 he sends that back to England. He says, you know, I'll send this in the government dispatch bag. He's like buddies with the colonial governor, and puts it in the like official government post, right? And so you've got one of Keats's letters entangled with that imperial colonial history. And so, like, that's the kind of thing that we're hoping the mapping project going forward can shed some light on. And so I think, yeah, there remain a lot of ways that people doing work in Romanicism can engage with letters and correspondence in new ways. And then the digital connection as well, right? Like there are so many great projects in Romanicism of a digital nature that, you know, going back to the early days, like the Blake archive starting up in the 90s and Romantic Circles starting up in the 90s. Like we've, in Romanicism, there's a long history of Romanicists doing cool work with digital technology. So I think that will continue going forward as well.
So this is something you mentioned a little bit earlier. You said that it was important for you to sort of think about the connection between the past and the present in the Keats Letters project. And whether at Wentworth Place or overlooking the Spanish Steps in Rome, Keats spent his last days in confinement, communicating by letter, of course, or even by short messages to Fanny, who's just on the other side of a wall. And so do you think Keats's 1820 writing resonates differently now because of our own recent experience with isolation? And are there particular letters that feel strikingly contemporary to you or strikingly relevant for our own moment?
Yeah, that's, I love that question. And I think certainly the contemporary relevance in this past year has been ratcheted up. I mean, just with the fact that Keats is in quarantine when he travels to Rome, right? Like that, that immediately took on a new kind of resonance. And he, I mean, he writes a letter from quarantine. So I'm trying to remember the exact date of that one. I think it's October 24th, 1820, to Mrs. Braun, to Fanny Braun's mother. I think I got that right. If we were doing a This Week in Keats video, this would be a moment where later on we go in and edit and put a little note saying like, wrong again, reject. Really screwed it up. But I think for me, the letters that that I always turn back to are the long journal letters he sends to America. And I think those in this past year have taken on additional resonance, because they're these very long letters that he writes over weeks and months, and the experience of George and Georgiana reading them is obviously very different than ours, where we can just take a book and like read it day by day. It's more like being there in the moment with Keats writing it. But because they're so extensive, right, it feels like this ongoing communication that, but at a distance, right? So reading those letters for me now feels kind of like the kind of communication we've all gotten used to this year, of being in constant contact with everyone, but always being at such a distance, such a remove. And so it's a very different kind of thing for Keats and for his correspondence. But yeah, that's a connection I sort of kept thinking back to when thinking about those long letters that are, I mean, they're remarkable for the way that they reflect on that situation of being at a distance, but feeling so intimately connected too. Especially there's one in, which one is it? I think it's the December 1818 to January 1819 letter to George and Georgiana, where he actually thinks of this kind of 19th century Zoom call. Basically, it's like, let's read Shakespeare at the same time on a Sunday night or whatever, and it'll be like we're there in the same room together. He didn't figure out time zones, but just an imaginary exercise.
No one has yet figured out time zones now either.
Yeah. I'd simply add, for me, it might be two letters. One is to go back to the November 30, 1820 letter. It's just Keats's final extant letter. It's so devastating, and right, it's the letter in which Keats declares that he feels he has a feeling as though he's living in a posthumous existence. And on the one hand, right, so it's this big declaration that has gained a lot of critical traction, but it's in the midst of Keats, boy, you see him working he has so many mixed feelings, and they're boiling up, but boy, he's maintaining this friendship with Brown in this letter. And it's just this performance of this kind of fully human performance. He's still being civil and friendly and funny and exuberant in there, and then being devastating but still trying to be a friend. It's a shocking, amazing document. And Keats can be amazing when he's at when he or when somebody else around him is at their darkest. So there's a letter from August 6, 1818 that he writes to Georgiana's mother, right after George and Georgiana have emigrated to the United States. And it's this letter that starts off, Keats has wrapped up his Northern Walking tour, but he's writing to Mrs. Wiley to kind of say, right, I know the grief you're feeling, right? Your daughter has left, right? You emigrate to the United States. There's a chance you're never going to see that, very good chance, you will never see that person again. And Keats ends the opening of that letter by saying, right, I won't try to make joy sorrow or sorrow joy. And then the letter cracks open and it becomes a comedic tour de force. It is just spectacular and lovely and funny and warm and personable, and just deeply humane. And for me, that kind of, right, for me, there's a little bit, and Lord knows I do not mean to attach like my feelings here to kind of Keats's extreme feelings, right, from what he was writing in that November 30th letter. But I think everybody has a sense that there is going to be, we're being deeply informed about what our lives are and what they mean and what our connectedness with others might mean. And we have to kind of be prepared for a different kind of existence, potentially. I mean, frankly, hopefully for a new kind of existence. I hope we don't go back to regular old modes. There's so much that just wasn't working. But to realize like that there's a humanity that's kind of deep in us and shared amongst us that can really kind of guide us through there, that feels still very kind of hopeful, hopefully ubiquitous and deep, that these reserves of possibility. And for me, those are some letters that reveal that to me, especially in these days.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna move us on a little bit now. So we've just been talking about isolation, and now I want to talk about community, which is what I get the sense that the whole of the Keats Letters project is. Your work has been about building this community to build around Keats, I think you've said. So can you tell us a little bit more about the community of scholars and readers that you've developed, and how would you like to make it grow in the future?
Yeah, as we've said from the beginning, I mean, it began, the project began in friendship and conviviality, right? Like at the pub, talking about the conference from, that day, like what we'd seen, what we were interested in. And I think that's always been kind of the mode we go for, right? Is like people who are engaged and interested in talking about this stuff together, and but also like, exploring. We're not trying to necessarily present work that's like completely figured out, like there's a lot of stuff we've done with the site to encourage like speculation and experimentation, trying out different things. And I think that's always easier to do when you've got a good community behind you. So the other thing I'd say is just like the site has created a lot of connections for all of us. Like there are many people who've written for the site and who are involved in one way or another that like were friends before, and that's sort of how things got going. Like the six of us that founded the site, like we all knew each other, we were all friends with one another, but we've also made a lot of friends this way, and just like it's been really nice to have these, they're professional relationships. They're building like contacts in our scholarly network, but it's also just, it's really nice to have these opportunities to meet new people who are, likewise friends of Keats. We always use that term, friends of Keats, but it's like, we are friends of Keats, but we become friends on our own terms as well in the process. And I think there's something about Keats and his writing in particular that encourages and enables that kind of connection to happen and to grow. So
Brian always gets a little embarrassed when I say things like this, but key to a lot of that community has been Brian himself. He's does a lot, and not to say that that's it. Again, it's a cooperative effort that, right, every time we do these projects. The interesting things about the small community of the co-editors is that, right, with some of these different projects, different people take lead and do other things, but Brian, in a certain way, has kind of been important to kind of the full churn of the project. And one of the things that he's attentive to is like when we put together the Adonais reading, was to really be attentive to people at different stages of their career, right? So this was one of the things that was amazing about that reading was, right, went from, grad students to mid-career people to Susan Wolfson, right? Like, so part of the joy was just kind of also seeing that and kind of being thoughtful about that. And then just thinking about the continued community. I mean, just to build off that, like within a day or two, one of the participants in the Adonais reading suggested, they're like, well, hey, what are we all doing? Is it January 20 in 2022 to kind of think about like, how are we commemorating Shelley, right? And then there'll be the question of how do we commemorate, but right, like, and then realizing that those are all, they're moments of commemoration, but then also moments of community and feeling that need for continued community.
Absolutely. So taking us back now to the link with sort of the contemporary moment, the Poet's Poet entry on the KLP website lists recent poems that were written to, from, or about Keats, and they have evocative titles, like one is called The Brown Aesthete Speaks, which is from the Harlem Renaissance, I understand. Another is Keats is Coughing, and even more strikingly, Keats is Dead, so fuck me from behind. Do you have So do you have any favorites, and what do you think they reveal about how poets of our own era approach Keats?
Mike, you're the poet, so I feel like.
So I teach, when I teach poetry writing, I love this book by the poet Dean Young called The Art of Recklessness. Just a great book, and he mentions Keats in it. Dean Young has a poem called "A Lily on Thy Brow," which is this poem, and it's spectacular. I think there's a link to it on that page, but you can look it up. You can kind of find it online, but it's worth checking out because it's this spectacular poem where you don't know that it's about, except for the hint of the title and its allusion to La Belle Dame. You don't know that it's about Keats until the end, and it just asks you to imagine that you're this worker in the early 19th century and you've been injured and gangrene starts setting in and you end up at a hospital and they're going to do this terrible surgery and you're going to die, you're going to suffer greatly, and you're still going to die in a couple of days. And then the end of the poem, what a great poem so far, right? But the end of the poem is that like, but like what you don't know is that like, right, one of the physician's assistants there is John Keats. And it's like, and it's great because it's this beautiful act of giving Moneda's eyes to Keats, right? So in all of this horrible circumstance, here is this effort, and of course, nobody has such magical powers, even natively capable Keats, right? But to try to bring some awareness to what's happening and be able to take that in and then to even think to articulate that, it's a fascinating transference of the relationship that you see between muse and poet in The Fall of Hyperion to then sufferer and poet, right? So we might be in an age without muses and gods these days, but we still do go to poetry for some sort of comfort, some palliative care at least. So I love, it's a spectacular, I love poetic turns, and that turn at the end where it's like, and there's Keats, it's like, where did Keats get? It's a fantastic moment in the poem. But like, there's so much great stuff. So one of the readers at the Adonais reading was Joyelle McSweeney, who has a recent book out that includes a crown of sonnets, kind of to and about Keats, and kind of thinking that through. And so one of the things that I love about Keats is how much is the variety of poets that Keats appeals to. Right, so you've got, right, Dean Young, who's a kind of more public, kind of comedic poet. Then you've got Joelle McSweeney, who's pretty hardcore avant-garde. So this range of poets who feel called in some way by Keats, and I kind of, that's pretty powerful. Like there's a whole, I'm tempted by love. So, and of course there's Tom Clark's great Junkets on a Sad Planet. Like, although I think Joelle has kind of done this, I'd love for a wildly avant-garde poet to do a whole Keats book, but I think Joelle is pretty close to that, actually. But anyway, I love that Keats calls out such a variety of responses.
Yeah, I love the playful poems that show up pretty regularly about Keats. So the Hera Lindsay Bird one you mentioned, Keats is dead, so fuck me from behind, is obviously a playful one. But I mean, it's a fascinating poem, and it sort of like went viral, or as viral as poetry can go, I guess, a couple years ago. But yeah, there are lots of other examples of like fun, playful poems. I've always loved Tony Harrison's A Kumquat for John Keats,
right.
Where he's in Florida imagining if only Keats could have had this amazing citrus, and actually, so I have to check my phone for this one, but I just texted this to Mike the other day. I was in a bookstore browsing at poetry, and there's a new book from Kim Adenizio, who's an American poet, and I was just flipping through the book, and there was a poem called, what is it? I Can't Stop Loving You, John Keats. And I didn't buy the book, but I did take a picture of the poem to send to Mike. I bought other poetry books, but yeah, I love the playful poems, and of course, in true Keatsian fashion, the playful poems are often mixing joy and sorrow, right? Doing the whole melancholy in the Temple of Delight and that whole thing. You know how that goes.
That whole thing.
So yeah, and the other thing I'd say is just like there are so many poets, contemporary poets, and across. So that post you mentioned, Miriam, I think it was mostly like the last few decades, but it was basically like the last 100 years or so. We had done another one where it was like 19th century tribute poems. And yeah, there are just so many examples. And it feels to me like there are more poems about Keats than pretty much any other poet in English. I mean,
very few people are writing to Southey.
Right.
I went for the punchline. Like, but even if we were to pick Byron, right? Clearly right. Not. Even if we were to pick Coleridge or Wordsworth or Felicia Hemans, who should get more poems. Everybody, poets, get on it, right? Like, but no, Keats. It'd be interesting for there to actually be a study of this. But Keats pretty clearly comes out ahead.
Of like early 19th century poets, I think if we put that limiter on it, certainly of early 19th century poets, there are no others that get as much love from contemporary poets as compared with Keats, maybe. But
this is where we're engaging in what Brian very generously called earlier speculation, right?
Making stuff up.
Sounds good.
Yeah. But no, but I feel like me being in a bookstore and flipping through and finding this poem to Keats, like I love that experience of just discovering new Keats inspired poems all the time. And in the process of making that post, like a lot of those were ones, you know, I'd never come across before.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot out there. And yeah. He's the poet's poet. It just feels right to me that that's the case.
Yep.
That's great. Maybe we'll keep an eye out on our social media channels for people share it any more. I mean, you've got a pretty great list. There isn't any you've missed, but maybe if there's some more Keats inspired poems, we can ask people to send them in. Thank you. There is so much more to talk about, but we'll have to close at least this conversation there for now, I think. So sorry. Thank you so much. It's been really exciting to hear about the potential for interviews, the potential concordance. That was really interesting. More collaborations on the way, and revisiting that crucial idea of Keats's letters as distinct from the poetry and worthy of their own study. Thank you. So thank you to Michael Tierney and Brian Rejack, and thank you to Marianne Wassif and Amy Wilcoxon for putting that interview together and asking those questions. And thank you to all the friends of Keats that I think will have taken the time to watch this interview if you're still listening to my outro bit. So thank you. You can find more about the Keats Letters Project if you go to keatslettersproject.com. And remember to check out the Keats-Shelley Association of America blog too. That's K-SAA.org. Keats Letters Project and the K-SAA are both on Twitter, so do find us there too if you want to get in touch and have a chat. Thank you very much for taking part in the interview, Mike and Brian, and I'll just end it there. Thanks.